Hey folks, and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about types of arguments that we make. So let's start with arguments of fact. And we went over all of these the first day of class or the first week of class when we talked about understanding arguments. I just want to give you a little bit more of an in-depth explanation about what these different types of arguments are. So let's start with arguments of facts. These are factual arguments. They come in many varieties, but the goal is always to establish whether something is or is not so. So, for example, is a historical legend true? Has a crime occurred? Are the claims of the scientific study replicable? While most people won't argue with established facts, like the earth revolves around the sun, it's not uncommon to challenge the authority of some facts. So, when does a fact become an argument? A fact becomes an argument when it's either controversial on its own or it challenges people's conventionally held beliefs or lifestyles. That's when we really begin to argue over these things. Then we have arguments of definition, and definitions really matter. So, arguments of definition often decide what someone or something is or can be. So, for example, a wolf in Montana either is or is not an endangered species, and that is going to determine whether or not you can keep it as a pet, whether or not you can kill it if it's, coming close to your cattle, things like that. An unsolicited kiss is or is not sexual harassment, and we have to define that and figure it out. And this is going to determine whether or not somebody goes to jail or loses their job or things like that. A person merits political or refugee status or they don't, right? So we have to figure that out in order so that the courts can make decisions. I have a picture of a giraffe up here because I didn't even know this until recently, but the argument over whether or not a giraffe is a mammal is something that has come up more than once, which, it's a mammal. But it's interesting that people are arguing over this definition. Definitions also include more than that, though. It's often just as important to think of what falls between what is and what is not in a definitional claim. In fact, a lot of disputes occur in what I like to call the murky middle. Think about how we define things like human intelligence. Can a computer possess human intelligence? We're still arguing about things like that. What is gender? What isn't gender? What is love? Are there different types of love? What about justice? How do we define that? What about free speech? What does free speech include and not include? So a lot of times when we seek to define these types of terms, that's when we enter into argument. So why not just look it up in the dictionary when we're talking about the definition of the word? Well, the truth is that dictionaries inevitably reflect the way that individual groups of people use a word at a specific time or place. A lot of times what something once meant is not what it still means. And so we have to redefine those words constantly. So if we look at the following, italicized terms, it's interesting to think about how we define these words. So graphic novels can be serious literature. Literature originally meant like pamphlet, and then it meant great piece of writing that had, some particular stylized form or was, a work of art. And for a lot of times people would have said, no, comic books or graphic novels can't be literature. But now that definition is changing. Burning a nation's flag is a hate crime. How do we define that term, hate crime? What is a hate crime? What isn't? College sports programs have become big business. How do we define that term, big business? Is something that's supposed to be nonprofit but is making a lot of money still count as a nonprofit, or is it a business? The menus at Taco Bell and Panda Express illustrate cultural appropriation. It's a buzzword. We've heard it a lot in the last couple of years, that term. What does it mean? What does it include? What does it not include? Does it make a difference that Panda Express was started by somebody from China and Taco Bell was not started by somebody from, Mexico? And like, how does that affect that term? A polyamorous should have the option of marriage. How do we define that term marriage? Does it mean the same thing that it used to mean? I mean, if we go back 150 years, a marriage is a business contract between a man and the father of a girl because they both had societal needs that needed to be met. And then, you go forward a period of time in history, and marriage is between one man and one woman, who are in love and are going to procreate and have children. And now marriage means something different. It means, a union between two consenting adults. And so we have this question here: should it be open to the possibility of a union between more than two consenting adults? How do we define that word? Or this last one: Satanism is a religion properly protected in the First Amendment. How do we define that term religion? What counts and what doesn't? And then we have evaluations. Evaluations are everyday arguments of judgment. By the time you leave your home in the morning, you have probably made a dozen informal evaluations: what to wear, what to eat, what route to take to work, whether or not to bring your umbrella. You look at the morning sky and you're like, ooh, that looks kind of cloudy. I think I'm going to grab my umbrella. That's an evaluation of the sky. We love evaluations in our modern society. People read reviews of books before buying them. We have entire blogs or YouTube channels devoted to reviewing only Batman comics or only Fortnite video games. We have magazines that are dedicated to reviewing cars. Many people make a lot of money by reviewing products and services online. Like, YouTuber or influencer is now a job, and people just tell you what products they use and love. We have college majors like film studies, which are dedicated to reviewing and evaluating. That's what they do. Literature classes are essentially evaluations. Read this, make a judgment about it. And then one of the things that I want you to know about evaluations is evaluations are always based on criteria, and it's a good idea to be aware of the criteria that you're using when you evaluate. So, for example, maybe you're evaluating a song, but maybe we're looking at the lyrical complexity, or maybe we're looking at the musical intricacy, or maybe we're looking at the album artwork, right? We can evaluate any of those things or all of those things and come up with different judgments based on how we were using the criteria. And a lot of times it's important to note that criteria is, usually, quantitative or qualitative. This means like, how amazing was this album versus how much money did this album make? And both of those are criteria that you can use, but if you're evaluating one album based on the music and one album based on how many copies it sold, they, might not be evaluated fairly. Then we also have causal arguments. Causal arguments are arguments that one or more cause is listed as the reason for something. So causal arguments exist in many forms. A lot of times they appear as part of another argument. So for example, a proposal to spend less time on social media might begin with the causal argument that social media can make someone experience depression from comparing themselves to others and from cyberbullying. So we're saying here that, I don't want you to spend time on social media. That's my argument. But we're also making the argument, the reason I don't want you to spend time on social media is because you can have depression. And the reason or the cause for that depression could be from comparing yourselves to others or from cyberbullying. It's important to note that causal arguments are almost always complex. They're very often definition-based, and they usually yield probable rather than absolute results. Obviously, not everybody who gets on social media experiences depression or compares themselves or is cyberbullied. So, usually it's like most people experience this type of thing. Okay, if you have any questions about these different types of arguments, feel free to reach out, send me an email, or drop your question in the class discussion board. I'll see you guys later.